Part 1. The Invitation to Stay. Ethan had been searching for a fresh start. After a bitter divorce and a job he couldn't stand, the old house on Elmwood Lane felt like a sign. Nestled deep in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the two-story Victorian looked like it had been frozen in time, a little worn, but full of charm. Best of all, it was absurdly cheap. The realtor was eager to close the deal. "It's been on the market for years," she said, her smile tight. "Not many buyers these days appreciate history." Ethan barely listened, already imagining how he'd decorate the spacious living room and make the house his own. Moving day was uneventful. Ethan unpacked his modest belongings, setting up a desk in the study and tossing an old couch in the living room. That first night, the house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt too intentional. The next morning, while exploring the attic, Ethan found something peculiar, a dusty trunk tucked beneath a decaying sheet. Its brass lock was rusted, but the lid opened easily under his touch. Inside were journals, some photographs, and a bundle of letters tied with a red ribbon. The letters were addressed to someone named Margaret, and the sender's handwriting was jagged, desperate. The ink on the first letter was smudged, but Ethan could still read fragments. "I don't understand the noises, it's like the house is breathing. Margaret, it's watching me. Please come back. I don't know how much longer I can stay here alone." Ethan shivered and shut the trunk, brushing it off as the ramblings of someone long gone. Later that evening, while he was making dinner, the first strange thing happened. The old radio he'd brought with him crackled to life on the counter. It wasn't plugged in. A woman's voice crackled through the static. "Get out." The words were so clear that Ethan stumbled back, nearly dropping the knife in his hand. He stared at the radio, heart pounding, but it was silent now. He chalked it up to exhaustion or a glitch. That night, Ethan struggled to sleep. Around midnight he woke to a peculiar sound, a low, rhythmic creaking, like footsteps pacing back and forth in the hallway outside his bedroom. Gripping his phone like a weapon, he stepped into the hall, but it was empty. He noticed something strange, though. The floorboards were dusty, but there was a clear trail of footprints leading toward the attic stairs. The air grew colder as he followed the trail up to the attic. The trunk he'd found earlier was open now, though he'd left it shut. The journals and photographs were scattered across the floor, and something else caught his eye. On the far wall, scratched deep into the wood, were the words, "You shouldn't have stayed." Part 2. The journal's warning. Ethan couldn't shake the unease that settled over him after the attic discovery. He spent the morning trying to convince himself that it had to be some sort of prank or his imagination. Maybe the scratches on the wall had been there all along, unnoticed. Maybe the trunk just didn't latch properly. But no matter how he rationalized, the image of the words, "You shouldn't have stayed," refused to leave his mind. Later that day, he decided to confront his fear. If he could read through the journals from the attic, maybe he could piece together the history of the house. He brought the trunk down into the living room, opening it carefully. The journal on top was battered, its leather cover cracking with age. The first page was dated October 12, 1972. "The noises started again last night. At first, I thought it was the wind, but no, it was something else. Something deliberate. It's always in the walls, moving like it's alive. I tried to sleep, but it whispered to me. It knows my name." Ethan's skin crawled, but he couldn't stop reading. "Margaret says it's just stress, but I know better. I've tried to follow the sounds, but they always stop when I get too close. This house isn't empty. It never has been." The entries grew darker, the writer's fear bleeding through the ink. The last entry was dated November 3, 1972. "Margaret left today. I begged her not to, but she said she couldn't stand the way I've changed. I told her it wasn't me. It's the house. It's in my head, my dreams. I see its shadow moving in the corners, even when there's no light. If she doesn't believe me, that's on her. But she'll see. When it takes me, she'll know I was right." There were no more entries after that. Ethan's heart was pounding by the time he set the journal down. His logical mind wanted to dismiss it as the ramblings of someone suffering a mental breakdown, but something about the way it was written felt real. Too real. As the sun set, the house seemed to take on a different personality. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, stretching just a little too far. Every creak of the floorboards made Ethan jump, and the silence was heavier, like the house itself was listening. Around midnight it started again, the same rhythmic creaking of footsteps in the hallway. Ethan froze in bed, straining to listen. The sound didn't fade this time. It grew louder, closer. Gathering his courage, Ethan grabbed his flashlight and stepped into the hallway. Nothing. But when he turned back toward his bedroom, the door slammed shut behind him with such force that it shook the walls. The flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment the beam caught something at the end of the hallway, something tall, distorted, and wrong. Ethan stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. When he scrambled to pick it up, the hallway was empty. Panicked, he bolted for the living room and grabbed the letters from the trunk. If the journals didn't have answers, maybe the letters did. His hands shook as he untied the ribbon and unfolded the first one. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic. "You can't leave. You don't understand. The house doesn't let you. It chooses you, and once it does, you're part of it. Forever." The radio crackled to life again, the same woman's voice cutting through the static. "You should have left when you had the chance." This time, Ethan knew he wasn't imagining it. Part 3. The Walls Have Eyes. Ethan spent the rest of the night pacing the living room, the old letters scattered across the coffee table. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he had read. The house had a reputation, he knew that much. When he bought it, neighbors had offered vague warnings, brushing them off with phrases like "old superstitions" or "bad luck." But none of that had prepared him for this. The morning light brought little comfort. The house felt different now, its silence unnerving rather than peaceful. Every creak of the floorboards or distant groan of the old pipes made Ethan flinch. Determined to get answers, he decided to investigate further. Starting with the walls. The journals had mentioned sounds, scratching, whispering, movement. Grabbing a hammer and flashlight, Ethan went room to room, tapping along the walls, listening for any hollow spaces. He was halfway through the hallway when he found it, a section of the wall that sounded distinctly different. With shaky hands, Ethan pried the panel loose, revealing a narrow, dusty crawl space. A nauseating smell hit him immediately, and he gagged, pulling his shirt over his nose. Shining his flashlight inside, he saw something that made his stomach drop, deep scratch marks gouged into the wooden beams, as if someone, or something, had clawed at it for years. Amid the dust and cobwebs, he spotted something else, a crumpled scrap of paper wedged between the beams. He reached for it, unrolling it carefully. "It's in the walls. It's always been in the walls. I tried to seal it in, but it won't stop. It's hungry." The paper was smeared with something dark, something that looked uncomfortably like dried blood. Before Ethan could process what he had read, a sudden noise made him whip around. A low, guttural scraping sound echoed through the house, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor upstairs. His heart pounded as he made his way to the staircase. The sound stopped as soon as he set foot on the first step. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. The house responded with silence. Reaching the top of the stairs, Ethan noticed something that hadn't been there before, a trail of black, oily smears leading down the hallway to the attic door. The door was slightly ajar, and the faint smell of decay wafted from the crack. Gripping the hammer tightly, Ethan approached the door and pushed it open. The attic was as he'd left it, the trunk still sitting in the center of the room. But something else had changed. The words scratched into the wall, "You shouldn't have stayed," were now gone. In their place was a single word, scrawled in jagged, uneven letters, "Run." Before he could react, the trapdoor to the attic slammed shut behind him. Ethan spun around, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Then he heard it. Whispering. Soft, insidious, and growing louder. The words were unintelligible, layered over one another like 1,000 voices speaking at once. The air grew colder, and Ethan's breath came out in visible puffs. "Who's there?" he shouted, swinging the hammer wildly. The whispering stopped, replaced by a deep, resonant voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "You let it out." The temperature dropped further, and the shadows in the corners of the attic seemed to move, shifting and writhing like living things. Ethan backed away, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape. The trunk. It was open now, though he hadn't touched it. Something inside it gleamed, a piece of broken mirror, reflecting a distorted, twisted version of his own face. He barely had time to scream before the shadows surged toward him. Part 4. The Thing in the Mirror. Ethan woke up on the attic floor, his body trembling and drenched in cold sweat. The air was heavy, oppressive, as if the house itself were alive and breathing. He sat up slowly, his hammer lying a few feet away, smeared with the same black substance he'd seen on the walls. The trunk stood before him, its lid now closed. The broken mirror shard inside was gone. He stumbled to his feet and made his way to the attic door, which now swung open easily, as though it had never been locked. Ethan's legs wobbled as he descended the stairs. He felt eyes on him everywhere, unseen, unblinking, but undoubtedly there. When he reached the living room, the house was eerily quiet. He slumped onto the couch, trying to catch his breath. His phone was on the coffee table, and he grabbed it, desperate to call someone, anyone. But the screen was black, and no amount of pressing the power button brought it to life. A faint noise drew his attention. It was coming from the hallway, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails against glass. "Hello?" he called out, though his voice sounded hollow and weak. The tapping grew louder, sharper. Ethan hesitated, then slowly rose to his feet. He followed the sound, which seemed to lead back to the hallway mirror. He froze as he saw it. The reflection wasn't his own. In the glass was a figure, a gaunt, shadowy thing with sunken eyes and a twisted grin. It stared at him, its head cocked unnaturally to the side. And then, without warning, it moved. The figure reached out, its hand pressing against the inside of the glass as though it were a window rather than a mirror. The surface rippled like water. Ethan stumbled backward, his mind racing with terror. The figure's hand pressed harder, cracking the mirror's surface from the inside. "Stop!" Ethan shouted, though he didn't know who, or what, he was yelling at. The mirror shattered, sending shards flying across the hallway. But when the pieces hit the floor, they didn't stop moving. They skittered like insects, forming a trail that slithered toward Ethan. Panic overtook him, and he sprinted back. Part 5. The Hollow Whispers. Ethan bolted up the stairs, his breath ragged, his legs trembling with each step. Behind him, the glass shards scraped and clinked against the wooden floor, following like a predator stalking its prey. He didn't stop until he reached his bedroom, slamming the door shut and twisting the lock. He pressed his ear to the wood, heart hammering in his chest. The house had fallen silent, but he knew better now. Silence wasn't safety, it was the precursor to something worse. Ethan turned and froze. The large mirror on his bedroom wall reflected the room behind him, but something was wrong. His reflection wasn't there. The room in the mirror appeared darker, distorted, as if it belonged to another dimension entirely. And then he heard it. A faint, hollow whisper emanated from the mirror. It wasn't one voice but many, overlapping, speaking in a language Ethan didn't recognize. He backed away, his pulse racing. "Who's there?" he managed to choke out. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Shapes began to form in the glass, shadowy figures writhing and twisting, their faces obscured but their movements deliberate. They pressed against the inside of the mirror, just as the figure in the hallway had. The whispers coalesced into a single, guttural phrase. "Let us in." Ethan stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of his bed. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "No, this isn't real. This isn't real." The door handle behind him jiggled violently, the lock rattling as though someone, or something, was trying to get in. He spun around, staring at the trembling door. And then the voices came from the other side of the door, low and guttural, mimicking the ones from the mirror. "Ethan," they hissed. "Let us in." His blood turned to ice. How did they know his name? The door creaked, the wood splintering slightly under the force of whatever was on the other side. Ethan grabbed the chair from his desk and shoved it beneath the doorknob. The voices stopped. The room felt deathly quiet again, save for Ethan's uneven breathing. He turned back to the mirror, dreading what he might see. The glass was empty. No shadows. No whispers. Just his pale, frightened face staring back at him. But then his reflection blinked. Ethan hadn't. The image in the mirror smirked, its eyes narrowing. And then, without moving its lips, it spoke. "You can't keep us out forever." The mirror cracked, spiderwebbing outward, but it didn't shatter. Ethan grabbed the nearest object, a heavy book, and hurled it at the glass. The impact shattered it completely, shards cascading to the floor. For a moment, everything was still. Then came the sound of footsteps from the hallway. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Ethan had no choice. He yanked open the bedroom window and climbed out onto the narrow ledge, gripping the frame for balance. He looked down at the dark yard below, the drop far too high to survive. Behind him, the bedroom door burst open. And then Ethan felt it, cold, skeletal fingers wrapping around his ankle, tugging hard. He screamed, kicking frantically, but the grip tightened, dragging him back into the house. Part 6. Dragged into the abyss. Ethan clawed at the windowsill, his nails scraping against the wood as the unseen force yanked him backward. The grip around his ankle was ice cold, like the touch of something long dead. "Let go!" he shouted, twisting desperately to break free. But the pull was relentless, dragging him back into the darkness of his bedroom. His fingers slipped, and he fell to the floor with a hard thud. The moment he hit the ground, the room changed. The walls pulsed as if alive, veins of black mold creeping and spreading across the surface. The air grew thick, and an overwhelming stench of decay filled his nostrils, making him gag. The bedroom was no longer his. It had transformed into a twisted, grotesque version of itself, furniture warped, the bed frame melted into the floor like a blackened skeleton. The doorway was gone. Ethan scrambled to his feet, his ankle still burning from the grip. He turned to face the mirror, or what remained of it. The shattered shards had not fallen to the ground. They floated in midair, rearranging themselves into a jagged, grotesque oval that seemed to shimmer with an unnatural light. And from that oval they emerged. Figures, translucent and shadowed, began stepping through the broken shards. Their forms were humanoid but wrong, bent limbs, elongated faces, and eyes that glowed a sickly yellow. They moved with an eerie, jerking motion, as though struggling to maintain their shape in the mortal world. Ethan stumbled back, his back hitting the wall. What do you want from me?" he gasped, his voice trembling. One of the figures stopped, its head tilting unnaturally to the side. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, Ethan heard a voice inside his head, a guttural, layered voice that seemed to echo from deep within. "You opened the way. You disturbed the balance." "I didn't do anything!" Ethan shouted. "This house, it was already like this." The figures took another step forward, their hollow eyes fixed on him. "You remain. That is enough." Ethan's skin prickled as a shadow slithered across the floor, creeping toward him. It moved like smoke, curling around his legs, tightening. Panic surged through him as he felt it climbing higher, cold and suffocating. He struggled to move, but his body was paralyzed. The largest of the figures raised a spindly hand and pointed to the center of the room. The jagged portal in the mirror shimmered, the air around it distorting like heat waves. Ethan's chest. Part 7. The Other Side. Ethan's screams were swallowed by the deafening hum that filled the room. The portal in the mirror pulsed, and the shadow gripping his body began dragging him closer to its jagged edges. The shards emitted a chilling energy, and he could feel his skin prickling as he was pulled closer. "No! Let me go!" he shouted, thrashing against the force holding him. But the shadows tightened, their grip like cold iron. The figures surrounding the portal began to chant, though their mouths didn't move. Their voices filled his head, a chorus of whispers speaking in a language he couldn't comprehend. The hum grew louder, vibrating in his bones. Ethan's feet left the floor, and he was suspended in the air, the portal now inches from his face. He caught his distorted reflection in the shards, a pale, terrified version of himself, eyes wide with fear. The mirror's surface rippled, as if it were liquid, and without warning, it swallowed him whole. He fell through darkness, weightless and spinning, his screams echoing in the void. His vision blurred, flashes of memories, his childhood home, his mother's voice, laughter, flickered around him like broken film reels. Then, with a jarring thud, he hit solid ground. Ethan groaned, his body aching from the impact. He pushed himself up, looking around. The air was thick with a sulfuric stench, and a sickly red glow illuminated his surroundings. He was in a cavernous space, the walls slick with a black, tar-like substance that pulsed faintly, as though alive. The floor beneath him was uneven, made of cracked stone. Strange symbols were etched into every surface, glowing faintly with the same eerie red light. He was no longer in his home. This place was ancient, wrong, a realm that didn't belong in the world he knew. In the distance, he could hear faint whispers, growing louder with each passing second. Shadows shifted along the walls, moving toward him. They weren't human. Ethan stumbled to his feet, his breathing ragged. He turned in a circle, searching for any sign of escape. The cavern stretched endlessly in every direction, but there was no door, no portal back. The whispers grew louder, sharper. They weren't just sounds, they were speaking to him, calling his name. Ethan! He spun around, but there was no one there. The shadows moved closer, coalescing into shapes. From the darkness, a figure emerged, tall and skeletal, its body wrapped in tattered blackened cloth. Its eyes were pits of fire, and when it spoke, its voice reverberated through the cavern. "You shouldn't have come here." "I didn't want to," Ethan shouted, his voice trembling. "I didn't ask for any of this." The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating. "This place is bound to your blood. You are part of the debt." "What debt? What are you talking about?" Ethan backed away, but his foot slipped on the slick ground, and he fell. The figure leaned down, its fiery eyes boring into his. "Your family opened the door centuries ago. Their sin is your burden." Before Ethan could respond, the ground beneath him began to quake. Cracks spread across the cavern floor, and a low, guttural growl echoed from the depths. "They're coming," the figure hissed, straightening. "And they will take you?" Ethan scrambled to his feet, panic surging. "Who? What's coming?" The figure didn't answer. It melted back into the shadows, leaving Ethan alone as the growl grew louder. The cracks in the ground widened, and from them emerged countless clawed hands, reaching for him. Ethan turned and ran, his footsteps echoing in the cavern. The whispers turned to screams, the hands clawing at his ankles, ripping at his clothes. He had no idea where he was going, but he knew one thing: if he stopped, he would never leave this place alive. Part 8: The Gathering. Ethan sprinted through the cavern, his breaths ragged and shallow. The air seemed to grow thicker with each step, as if the place itself was trying to suffocate him. The clawed hands erupted from the ground behind him, scraping and grasping, their jagged nails glinting in the faint red light. A deafening roar shook the cavern, and Ethan dared a glance over his shoulder. What he saw made his heart freeze. The cracks in the floor were no longer just fractures, they were gaping maws, lined with rows of sharp, glistening teeth. From their depths, monstrous shapes clawed their way upward. Twisted, grotesque creatures with misshapen bodies, their eyes glowing the same eerie red as the walls. "Run!" Ethan whispered to himself, pushing his legs harder, though they felt like lead. He didn't know where he was going, he just knew he had to get away. Ahead, a faint light appeared, a flicker of hope in the endless darkness. Ethan stumbled toward it, his lungs burning, the sounds of pursuit growing louder behind him. As he drew closer, he realized the light was coming from a massive stone archway, its surface covered in glowing runes. The air around it shimmered, as though it were a mirage. Without hesitation, Ethan dove through the archway just as something cold and slimy grazed his ankle. He hit the ground hard, rolling to a stop. Gasping, he scrambled to his feet and turned to look back. The creatures were clustered at the threshold of the archway, writhing and hissing. They clawed at the air, but an invisible barrier held them back. One of the larger creatures, its face a grotesque amalgamation of human and animal features, let out an ear-splitting screech, its glowing eyes fixed on Ethan. He took a shaky step back. The chamber he had entered was vast, its walls towering impossibly high. The floor was made of smooth, black stone, and in the center of the room stood a massive altar. Around it, hooded figures were gathered, their robes a deep crimson that seemed to drink in the faint light. They moved in unison, their hands raised, chanting in a low, guttural tone that made Ethan's skin crawl. He froze, unsure whether to approach or retreat. But as he stood there, one of the figures turned toward him. The hood fell back, revealing a face that made Ethan's stomach lurch. It was his father. "Dad?" Ethan's voice came out hoarse, disbelieving. The man stepped forward, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and shadowed. Yet there was no mistaking it. This was the man Ethan had buried 5 years ago. "You shouldn't have come here, Ethan," his father said, his voice hollow, devoid of the warmth Ethan remembered. What is this place? What's happening?" His father gestured to the altar, where something massive and shrouded in shadow loomed. Ethan couldn't quite make it out. It was as though the thing refused to be fully seen. "This is where it began," his father said. "And this is where it will end." "I don't understand," Ethan shouted. "What's going on? Why are you here?" The other hooded figures began to turn, their faces hidden in shadow. The chanting grew louder, reverberating through the chamber. The altar began to glow, and the shadowy mass on it stirred. "Leave, Ethan," his father said, his voice urgent. "Before it's too late." "I can't leave. I don't know how. You're tied to this place, just as I am. But you have a choice. You can still escape." Before Ethan could ask how, the shadow on the altar let out a deep, resonant growl. The figures around it raised their arms higher, their chants reaching a fever pitch. The glow from the altar grew blinding, and Ethan shielded his eyes. When he looked back, his father was gone, and the shadow had begun to take form. Ethan's heart pounded as he backed away. The creature emerging from the altar was unlike anything he had ever seen. Its body was a chaotic mass of shifting shapes, its form constantly changing. Eyes, mouths, and claws appeared and disappeared across its surface. The chanting stopped abruptly, and the hooded figures turned toward Ethan in unison. "You were never meant to come here," they said in a single, echoing voice. "But now you will serve." The creature surged toward him, and Ethan ran, the altar's light casting his long shadow ahead of him. Behind him, the sound of the creature's pursuit was deafening, a cacophony of growls, screeches, and the sickening squelch of shifting flesh. The archway loomed ahead, but as he reached it, he found the shimmering barrier had vanished. The creatures from the cavern spilled through, converging on him from all sides. He was trapped. Like and subscribe to the channel.